Two figures I'd like to talk about next, Saints Cedd and Hilda. Cedd is one of the lesser known figures of the 7th century, but a really important and interesting guy. I also want to talk a little bit about Hilda of Whitby. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to get to Whitby this trip. Her story is so great, though, that I really wanted to include it here. And Cedd's story and Hilda's story are kind of intertwined. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about Saint Cedd. He was the older brother to Cedd and two other brothers. All four of them belonged to a noble family, and all four of them went on to become priests. Cedd and Cedd were also bishops. Cedd was the oldest, and so was kind of the head of the family. They all belonged to the more Celtic side of this dispute that we've been talking about between Celtic and Roman Christianity. Almost everything we know about Cedd comes from Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Cedd was probably formed as a priest at the abbey in Lindisfarne up in the north. He was sent by King Oswy to evangelize the Mercians, and they were a tribe kind of in the middle of England. And this is part of Oswy's effort to expand his influence over the region. After that, Oswy sends him to the kingdom of the East Saxons. We call it Essex today. It's the area just northeast of London. He had some success during that mission, and he ends up being consecrated as Bishop of the East Saxons by the Bishop of Lindisfarne. At this point, the Celtic model still had bishops that kind of went to kingdoms and peoples rather than bishops that were based in locations and cities. And that's one of the key differences between the Celtic and the Roman system. After a change in royal leadership in Essex, Cedd decides that it's not a great place for him to be anymore. The situation is not nearly so friendly, so he heads back up north. While later he's invited to the Synod of Whitby to, again, sort of finally deal with this issue of Celtic and Roman Christianity in England. Now, there were a lot of people speaking a lot of different languages at the council. There was Old Irish and Old English and Frankish and Latin, and not very many people spoke all of them. Now, Cedd was one of those people, and because of his reputation for holiness and diplomacy, he was able to act as a neutral interpreter throughout the whole council. And that's one of the things Cedd is best known for. He also founded a few monasteries, one in a place called Tillieburg and one in a place called Ithenchester, and the most famous at Lastingham. Cedd is abbot at Lastingham until he dies. He still acts as a missionary bishop, but he sort of uses Lastingham as a retreat. He would kind of go out and come back to the monastery to kind of recharge his spiritual batteries. He dies when a plague kind of ravages the region, and he is succeeded by his younger brother, Cedd, who we'll hear about hopefully a little bit later in this pilgrimage. Now, I also want to talk about Hilda of Whitby. She's another towering figure at this time. She comes out of a royal family. Her father was poisoned, so she was an orphan. She was raised by her uncle. She was baptized at the age of 13 when her uncle converted, and the whole family and household were baptized together. When she was 33, she was invited by St. Aidan, the Bishop of Lindisfarne, to come north and found an abbey. And she founds the abbey at Whitby. She founds it as a Celtic monastery, using the Celtic system. And it's a double abbey, so it's composed of both men and women, and they probably lived in huts. So there would have been like one hut with a couple men and one hut with a couple women in it. Now, during her time, her monastery produced 5 bishops, 2 of whom would go on to be regarded as saints by the church, Wilfrid of York and John of Beverley. Despite coming from an upper-class background, Hilda apparently embraced her responsibility to care for all of her monks and nuns. She encouraged one of her lay monks, a guy named Cadman. He wanted to write spiritual poetry and songs, but didn't think he could, and she encouraged him. One of his pieces actually survives. It's called Cadman's Hymn, and it's 9 lines of alliterative verse. It's one of the 3 oldest examples of Old English, and the oldest piece of sustained poetry that we have written by a single author in any Germanic language. So one last cool thing to add about Hilda. According to the tradition, there were snakes where Hilda's monastery was. And she broke off their heads, snapped them off, and asked God to turn them to stone. Now, the cool part is that there's a lot of Ammonites at Whitby, and they apparently inspired the legend. And that's why Hilda is often depicted standing on snakes and kind of curled up snakes. It's really awesome. So Hilda of Whitby and Cedd of Lastingham are two figures that kind of worked to build compromise at a time of kind of great conflict in the church. They were real witnesses to holiness. They both built important religious communities that helped form people as Christians. So we give thanks for their work and their witness in the church. I'm here in Lastingham, and behind me is the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin, which is the site of the shrine of St. Cedd. Coming into the church, it's very clear it's a real parish. There's people that come every Sunday morning. It's got all the kind of regular parish stuff. In the back, there are stairs leading down into the shrine itself. What struck me is how much the people here must really care about this shrine and care for the pilgrims that come. There's a place for a prayer board for folks who come to the shrine. There's a place to light a candle. And you can kind of feel, just being in the space, that for 1,300 years, the people of Lastingham have cared for this place and invited people to be a part of this history of prayer. I found myself reflecting on the folks who are called to serve at General Convention and other people who are called to the councils of the church, and thinking about how Cedd operated to kind of bring different groups together. I found that very compelling, and I found my prayers coming back to that over and over again.